night out there, and you're here. How great. Thank you for making the effort. And my prayer is that for all of us, God will do the unexpected amongst us and lead us into new and good things. So I'm really delighted to be here with you tonight to share some of these things. The slide you see up is for the McRae Center, and I feel the need to share this with you because the McRae Center, named after, of course, the recently late Andrew D. McRae, and the center was founded really to help people engage with matters of faith and culture in terms of the research that we produce, in terms of the kinds of courses that we build and teach, and also in providing resources for the wider church. And as my sort of sabbatical is coming to an end, I'll be putting much more attention to this. So be watching for it. I just want to flag it for you because the kind of thing we're doing tonight is the kind of thing we envision resourcing for many churches and many people to be able to engage the world we live in. Now, when we talk about engaging the culture, sometimes we can get either defensive or afraid. And we tend to get defensive because we're afraid. And I'm one who thinks that we actually don't have anything to be afraid of. I mean, if we have anything to be afraid of, it's something small. It's not anything big. And I think it's actually a great adventure that we go on, rather than something that's terrifying. It's a chance to step back from the culture of which we're part and to look and to say, well, what is this world we live in? How has it influenced me? How do I influence it? What is that dynamic? How do we understand it? So that as we live for Christ in the midst of it, we can be as wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves in the ways that we share the message of Jesus Christ and the way that we live for him in the midst. I mean, sometimes, let's face it, we're our own greatest enemy. You know, we bring on conflict when we don't actually need to bring on conflict. And we'll go to the wall for things that we don't actually need to go to the wall for. And then when the big moments come, where that's a time to really take a stand, we're not sure, we're not confident, we don't know that that's the right time and the right place to do it. And so having these kinds of conversations, I think, will help us to explore some of those issues, at least in theoretical form in this room. And I hope that as the panel unfolds, we'll have a lot of opportunity to do that together tonight as well. So why do we talk about culture? Well, we talk about culture, and I'm going to see if I can work this, because earlier I was doing liturgical dance and frustrating Dr. Zacharias to no end. Sorted me out. So why do we want to engage culture in the first place? Well, for a long time, remember, Christianity was the dominant culture. I argue that it still is. Like, I don't think we've lost as much ground as we think we've lost. We still have a lot of privilege as Christians in this land, and far more privilege than we imagine ourselves to be. But because we're moving into an era where the level of privilege is shrinking and the level of advantage is getting lower, we tend to think, ooh, we're on the back foot. And this has made us feel very insecure. Many of our churches face decline. We find a lack of response amongst people when we offer invitations or conversations about Christ. We see laws changing. We feel we're losing something. Something is missing. Something is gone. When in actual fact, it's a shifting culture. And so we have to readjust our understanding of that culture that we're in. We used to have to do cultural training when we went overseas as missionaries. But if we're going to embrace the mission to our culture, we have to do that same detailed work here. We have to understand the world that we live in. And we have to understand how it influences our faith, because remember, the culture is part of who we are. We are part of the culture. It's not as if here's the church here, and then out there is the big bad world. Like, we are out there, aren't we? I mean, don't you have jobs and families and lives? I mean, we're out there. Aren't we watching TV and film and on the internet? We're being formed by the culture as well. And so we have to understand it for, I think, at least those two reasons. One, how the contemporary culture is influencing our faith so that we can unpick some of those things that maybe, just maybe, come into conflict with the gospel, but have become practices and habits for us in our lives. To at least be able to compare and contrast the way we live our lives with what we're being challenged and encouraged to do through Scripture. But also to understand how to live out our life in the contemporary culture. recognizing with humility that we're never going to get it 100% right. Right? That takes the pressure off. Sometimes we feel like, I just need the right word, the right moment, the right action. Relax. Relax. It's about being exactly the person that God made you to be and called you to be in the midst of all of your relationships at work, at school, at home, and in your community. So I think this is why culture. We have to understand both of these things. But when we think about the world, sometimes as Christians, our response has been isolation and panic. A little bit like this clip. I don't think I'm going anywhere, am I? Run a clip, thanks. I'm going to do that liturgical dance again.
Turn the music off.
And how's Georgie doing? He's doing great. I love working with that big guy.
Keep the noise coming, Charlie. I'm on a roll today.
George and I are like brothers. 2319! We have a 2319!
George Sanderson, please remain motionless. Prepare for decontamination.
Oh, not the CD.
Stand back. Careful. Situation is 990, ready for decon. Hey, thanks, guys. That was a close one.
Okay, people, take a break. Got to shut down for a half hour and reset.
Is it possible that we have looked at culture as a contamination of our faith? And that we live our lives through the week, but then, church, faith, it's something else. Don't let it in, it's going to contaminate. Don't even talk about it, it's going to contaminate. And we have to understand that the God who is with us here is the same God who is with us everywhere. The thing that we might identify as the contaminant might not even be the most poisonous thing that we're carrying around with us. And so I think we can, in this conversation, relax a bit and understand that the journey that we're on is actually a really exciting one. It's a call to reevaluate who we are as people of faith in the contemporary realm and how we live out the faith and the things that we believe and the places where we go and how we then bring that back into worship. But let's ask, first of all, what is culture? What is culture? I can go backwards. Oh, I can go forwards too. Well, they often say, if you want a definition of culture, you shouldn't ask a fish. Or, let me put that a different way. If you want a definition of water, you shouldn't ask a fish. Why not? Why wouldn't you ask, isn't a fish water? Come on. Why would you not ask a fish? You can't speak. Let's assume in my fantasy world, if the fish could speak, there's a clever one in every group. If the fish could speak, and you asked him, why not?
It's just too obvious to the fish. He breathes in, he's in it.
It's the only world he knows, right? So if you ask the fish, what is water, and he could speak and understand. It's an alien fish, okay? What are you talking about? Water? He has no comparison of anything that's any different. Water is what he swims in. And culture for human beings is very much the same. And if someone says, what is your culture? Well, for most of us in Canada or in North America, It's particularly bad if you're Canadian. If you remember being in school and they'd say, what is Canadian culture? They'd have like, dress up as a Canadian Day, we'd all just wear jeans, right? We don't know, what are we? We don't know, it's the culture, it's the water we swim in, it's the air that we breathe, it's who we are. And so, how do we actually come to terms with what that is? How do we understand it? Well, one of the ways that we come to understand it is when we actually get out of it and we visit somewhere else. And for many of us, that's the first time we became aware of the cultural lenses that we look at the world through. And you can probably remember some of those times. You encountered a different culture, somebody who does things a different way, and your first response is, well, that's just wrong, right? And then as you think about it and you experience it more, you realize, well, maybe it's not so wrong. Maybe that's the way that they've done this for a long time. You know, I think about the first time I visited Germany, and I was visiting my friend there, and I'm a Canadian. I'm really big on, you know, you hold the door for someone and they say thank you, right? And I was holding all these doors in Germany, and they were all walking through, and not a single person said thank you. And I thought, how rude. And I said to my friend, I said, why are the Germans so rude? And she said, well, what do you mean? Thankfully, they're not easily offended. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, I keep holding the door for people, everybody walks through, nobody says thank you. She said, well, why would they? It's not what we would do. But that had nothing to do with rudeness from her perspective. It was a different way of being. And so, oftentimes, the way that we've been formed in church contrasts, perhaps, with the way that people have been formed outside. But in many ways, the way that everybody in our broader culture has been formed, we have also been formed in the same way. So, it's important for us to stand back from our culture and take a look at it in a different way. It's the water we swim in. It's part of our individual behavior that's learned from the group that we're part of and that's shared with others. This can be, when I talk about culture, I'm talking about the broader culture, but it also breaks down into subcultures and smaller cultures, groupings, and ways that smaller groups within our culture do things. Perhaps even so close as to being particular family traditions and so on. This is the way we do things in our family, and culture can become very localized in that way. So the water we swim in, part of an individual's behavior that's learned from a particular group and shared with others. Culture is collective mental programming, shared basic assumptions about the way the world is, or the spirit of a people and their symbols, as it's often described. The signs that we rally around, the things that we relate to. Hockey night in Canada, right? We all know what that is. Although it was really interesting, because I was recently out west, and their whole experience of hockey night in Canada is so different from ours in the east, because they sit down for supper and watch hockey night in Canada. Like, who would ever imagine that? But that's the way it is. So it's an artificial secondary environment that humans impose on the natural. Our culture is not the same thing as our natural environment, but they do relate. One influences the other. So, for example, if you live in a cold country, you're probably not going to develop a cafe culture. Probably not, at least not through the winter months. So the environment that we live in has an influence on the culture that develops, but it's not to be equated with it. What else do we have? Did I go the other way? I don't know where to point. Where do I point? Sorry, I'm
Point
looking
anywhere.
at this. Anywhere?
Just click.
Just click. You always say that, Dave, it never works for me. Remember that kid on Polar Express? It just doesn't work out for me. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. All right. So, if we want to consider how culture is that human mark on the natural, here are some examples. A river is nature. A river is nature. But you form that into a canal that achieves human ends, our own purposes, then it's culture. A moan is nature, but you form that moan, that groan into a word, and it's culture. A raw piece of quartz might be nature, but you form that quartz into an arrowhead, an object of war, it becomes culture. So are you with me on that? You get the difference? Yeah. Okay. In the history of theology and of studying culture, particularly the way that the church and our faith has engaged with culture. There's a very famous book written by Richard Niebuhr, and this was written in the middle of the century, and he devised different categories that he observed how the church related, or the main attitudes that the church had to culture. And I'm going to look at just 3 of them briefly with us tonight. So he noticed that in history there were points where the church had this basic attitude of being against the predominant culture. It would take a protectionist stand. It would pull away and seek to withdraw and say, we're not participating in this, that, or whatever the other thing is. We're staying separate. As an example, he would use, say, the Anabaptists, or the Mennonites in the United States, for example, and the Amish, and the way that they preserve a different time and a different place, and they withdraw intentionally from the prevailing culture. And he would see that as a Christ against culture attitude. We can talk about whether it is or not in a few minutes, but he saw it that way very much because they did not want to partake of the culture, the broader culture that other Christians did. So this was seen as a Christ against culture attitude. Now, as we go through these, think about which one you think is your default position. Because most of us, although we would find ourselves moving between these, depending on what the issue is, depending on where we are in our life, most of us have been raised probably to have a default position here of one or the other. So, Christ against culture. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, is the Christ of culture view. And he noticed that at some points in history, church had the view of culture that really the world is no different from the church. It's all the same thing. God is just as present in one as he is in the other. And so we can go to the culture, we can look for things happening in culture and say, there's God at work, and there's God at work. For example, the social gospel at the turn of the last century very much identified with labor movements, for example, as evidence of God at work in culture. And they said, we just need to get on board with that as Christians. It didn't need to be Christianized in any particular way because God was already doing that. That was already Christ at work in culture. Very little distinction then between the life of the church and the way we understood culture. So those are the 2 opposing views, Christ against culture and Christ of culture. And then Niebuhr identified several different ones, really, that were in between these positions. And I won't talk about all of those, but some of them held those 2 positions kind of in attention. And it's important to consider that possibility. Some, and Niebuhr's favorite position was actually the idea that Christ transforms culture, that Christ is at work around us through the church, in the church, but also in the culture to bring about his purposes in it. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand Niebuhr on this point. I think they think that he was looking for a Christ-transforming culture so that a culture would become Christianized. And we have to think very carefully about what it is that we're thinking about when we think that Christ is going to transform culture. Are we looking for Christ to dominate culture? Are we looking for a theocracy? And I would argue, actually, that that's not what we're looking for. But we look to be equipped as Christians to move about in the culture, ways that help us to be salt and light within it. We can unpack Niebuhr in a slightly different way as we relate to film. This is Rob Johnston down at Fuller. He's done a lot of work on media. And he says that we can trace the relationship of churches to culture as we look at church attitudes towards film over the last century. And this is actually really interesting. So he notices that evangelical churches at first would start out with this position of avoidance. Don't go to the movies, right? Because you'll get poisoned or corrupted or whatever it is. Don't go. Anybody remember those days? I don't know, maybe a few of you, right? Don't go to the movies. And then he said in the main, and he's talking about mainstream evangelicalism here, then you could go to the movies but with caution. So go, but be careful. Be very choosy about what you go to. For example, I remember Dr. McRae once saying that they were very much an avoidance church in Scotland, the Scottish Baptists in his day. But he said when Ben-Hur came out, they were allowed. So go with caution. Go with caution. Be careful. And then we moved more into this position of okay, you can go to the movies, But don't just go and check your brain at the door. Go and dialogue. You know, bring your scriptures, bring your Christian education into conversation with the movie that you're having. This is probably where I was when I was in youth group growing up, and we used to do this kind of thing all the time. We would bring the films we were watching or the music we were listening to youth group, and we talk about what are the messages that are unfolding here. We would have this discussion, and we were never told, you know, don't listen to that. It was much more, be thinking about what it is that you're listening to. And I have to say I'm really grateful for that, because I think that's probably where my first interest in relating faith and culture began to emerge. So those of you who work with young people, don't underestimate your influence on those people for the future. Rob Johnston then noticed that some Christians were moving towards a view of appropriation, where you can actually go to the cinema and there are values that are presented there that you can take on board. So not just things that you have to filter or see in conflict, or just you can take those on board. You can see them as messages that are complementary to your faith. And then finally, he noticed that in the latter part of the century and into the present, we have increasing numbers of people believing that you can go to the cinema, or he talks about the cinema, but I think we can see this in many different venues. Christians can go there and they actually seek divine encounter. And at first we might scoff about that. That's my initial inclination, is really, you're going to go and have a divine encounter, you know, at the cinema? But how many of us can think about times and places where we were, not only in church, when God met us and spoke to us in a way, through something we saw, a conversation that we had, a song that we were listening to, a movie that we watched, and some truth of Scripture, some encounter of God came to us and delivered that home. And I think what that affirms is that God is at work everywhere. And we often think of the world scripturally as an evil place. And certainly there are certain scriptures that portray the world as the sphere of the enemy's activity. But that's not the whole biblical picture. The whole biblical picture, from Genesis right through, affirms that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And there's nowhere that we can flee from His presence. His Spirit is everywhere. He wants to encounter His people. He wants us to meet with Him. This is the exciting thing I think about these topics, is understanding how much God wants to make Himself known. And if people are in church, He'll find a way. He'll make Himself known. And we get to be a part of that or not. But I find it really exciting that we might actually get to be a part of it. So this idea of divine encounter, it's a really interesting one that I think is worth further conversation than we can have about it tonight. How does God actually meet people in these places? And what do they need then for that encounter, that revelatory encounter, to bring them to a fuller faith? A faith where they would be confident about their belief and so on. I'm going to skip over the next one, I think, because that just lays those two categories together. I'm going to very quickly look at this diagram, because we often think that what we do in culture won't have any influence. And I think when we recognize that culture is made up of people, and that it's a dynamic, it's a changeable, moving dynamic, we can actually be quite confident that we can have an impact. And I'm going to give you just a quick view of this. This is the dynamics of how we might actually start to change the water in which we swim. If we think of culture made up of these things, rituals and symbols, stories and myths, structures and systems, values and beliefs, I'm going to give you an example so that you can see how that works together. And these things feed each other. It's a dynamic, it's moving. They feed each other and they shift. So if I were to describe a value and a belief of British culture, I would say the commitment to fair play is something that they find really important. Fair play. The underdog has to have a day, right? Fair play. Nobody should get so far down that they're crushed. Fair play. It's a value, a belief that's held. In the stories and myths, it's told in the myth of Robin Hood, right? He robs from the rich and he gives to the poor. Fair play. Nobody gets too far disadvantaged. And then in the structures and systems, we see it in a national health service, where people receive health care free at the point of delivery, right? These are things that as Canadians we also understand. So I'm using it as an example because it's away from here, but something we also can relate to. Rituals and symbols. Well, I think it's the ritual or symbol that really embodies this belief the most is the cue. Do you know what a cue is? It's a lineup, right? Now, Brits queue. They love a queue, don't they? They love a queue. And you can be driving down the street and people won't be all gathered in a crush at the bus stop. They'll be lined up right along the pavement. Why? Because the person who got there first should get to go first. It's fair. It's just. It's a beautiful thing. And when we came back from vacation after our first kind of long chunk of time in the UK, and I went into a store and I wanted to be waited on, and I kind of went up to the counter and there was someone in front of me, so I stood a respectable distance back, right? But it was clear I was next. But somebody else came in and kind of elbowed up in front of me, hey, how you doing? And kind of, what do you mean, how am I doing? Get out of my way. And I'm thinking all this, but I'm not saying it because I'm Canadian, right? As well as British, which is really confusing. And so this happened like 3 times, I'd say. 3 times before. It took everything in me not to say, if you'd all just get in queue, it would be fine. I was so frustrated. And I found my elbows again, and it was all fine. But you see how that dynamic works. They all feed in together. Well, what happens if fair play is no longer a value that's held? Let's say a different story starts to get told besides Robin Hood, and the value starts to shift. It takes time, but it happens. What happens then? Well, we'll see a resonance in the systems and the structures as they exist, and we'll see a change in the rituals and symbols and the way that we act as a culture and behave together. So culture is a dynamic. It's moving. It's changing all the time. And if Christians withdraw from participation, what say do we have and where it goes? But if we participate fully, without seeking to necessarily dominate, but participate and live our lives and uphold the values that we think are worth defending, things like, I believe, freedom of religion. You know, do we want to see the whole of the government Christian? I don't think so. But do we want freedom of religion in our country? Yeah, that's something we want. Then we have ways that we can communicate those things with intelligence and feed into the culture so that the culture develops and moves in its dynamic in a way that is good for everyone in the common good, because Christians have a lot of wisdom to contribute to these discussions. We have the wisdom of God, potentially, but we also can get in the way ourselves, and we forget that sometimes. So again, we study culture to understand how contemporary culture influences our faith, to understand how to live our faith in contemporary culture. We don't realize how much our culture shapes our faith. Don't be scared by that, because God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ and given us sufficient knowledge for salvation. We have a lot of ability to study the scriptures and to grow as disciples. But our faith is influenced as well by the culture in which we live. It's normal. Jesus came into a culture. He affirms culture. He came in a time and a place and a body. If you live in a time and a place and in a body, you have a culture and it influences your faith. It's the way that we are. We don't have some kind of unembodied access to the hereafter. Take a look at this. Who knows who that is? Is it Jesus? Supposedly. So you've been with me all along, haven't you? Well, this is the Victorian Jesus, really, isn't it? I mean, but when I was growing up, I had this bookmark in my Bible. Anybody else? The first Bible I was given by my church in Sunday school had this bookmark in it, and I thought it was like a photograph. I mean, isn't this what Jesus looks like? You know, it's just a slightly post-Victorian portrait, and it has all the characteristics of Victorian portraiture, with his gaze, his nose, the shape of his hair, the lighting, all of it. But we often think the way that we conceive of Jesus is the way It must be the way that he really is. It's okay. It's okay that I thought this is what Jesus looked like. But Jesus is bigger than my imagination. It doesn't mean that he can't meet with me exactly where I am, though, because he will. What other examples do we have? There's an indigenous Jesus, a Jesus that relates to their experience, an African Jesus of community. These are just images that different people have portrayed of Jesus. There was an Asian Jesus there, bearing the cross. And this is what the BBC says Jesus probably actually looked like. I don't think he looked as bewildered as they think. But basically, a man of Jesus' time and place, this is much more what he would have looked like. And we say he was a carpenter, but he was a builder. There's not a lot of wood in the Middle East. He would have been building with brick and stone. He was strong and sturdy. He wasn't quite the Victorian. Strong and sturdy. So we know that Jesus existed in history in a particular way. That's something we need to grab hold of. Because a lot of people think that Jesus is made up. How can they think that when there's so much evidence for his existence and what he was like? We've done a bad job of communicating that, right? The evidence is there. We need to be able to present it for the existence of Jesus in history. And I'm really grateful for people who work in that. And we have to recognize, too, that the way that we imagine Jesus to be does not exhaust Jesus of his meaning. You know, how we imagine Jesus to be, it's a wonderful thing. Because that's how we know him, and that's where we meet him. But if we stop letting him tell us who he is, and we just keep him in that box of who we think he is, that's when I think we really run into trouble. So I think we have a great confidence in our faith, a great confidence. But my faith is not in my faith. My faith is in Jesus Christ, and who he was and who he is. My faith is not in my faith, and so my faith can grow. My faith can be stretched. My faith can be challenged, and that does not change who Jesus Christ is for the world. But we feel under threat sometimes, don't we? We come across things like this on the internet. We're kind of bombarded with this stuff all the time. And it's silly. On the one hand, it's silly. You know, Christianity, the belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him you accept him as your master, so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree, makes perfect sense. You've seen this sort of thing, right? I've seen most of it, but maybe I go looking for it. I don't know. There are those moments, are there not, when our faith feels under fire and we think, we have that kind of existential moment where you sit back and you look at your faith and you think, that seems a bit weird. Seems a bit weird. And it's because of the cultural influence that we have around us all the time that makes us see ourselves in a different light. And yet, this is really such a mocking thing. And rather than think, well, I can't, we tend to do one of two things. We get into an internet fight, which is purposeful, useless and purposeless, and a complete waste of time. Like, start with the people you know. You know, it has to be relational. Start with the people you know. And don't get sucked into these conversations online. It goes nowhere. It's ridiculous. It has to be relational in the first instance. But second of all, you know, we have to understand that for some people it does seem crazy. It does seem crazy. Do we know enough about our own faith to be able to meet people's questions where they are and to be able to have a conversation that is actually led by them and not by our agenda, that's led by Christ's agenda and not ours, even if our underlying agenda is that they would come to faith? Of course it is. We can't pretend it's not. Let's be honest with people. That is what we would love to see for people if we love them. But at the end of the day, it's the work of the Holy Spirit. We offer, we do the hard work that we can do to give the information that people need, to answer their questions, to sit with them over coffee and to have the conversation. But at the end of the day, the work is not ours, it's the work of the Holy Spirit to bring people to faith. And And there are times when God just surprises us. If I had time, I'd tell you another amazing story of something that happened to me this year that just reinforced that for me in so many ways, that God is just about bringing people to himself. And we're so caught up in our own lives and our own agendas that we miss it. We miss it. But he's doing it, and he's bringing people to himself. And if we get to be a part of it, how much more exciting is that? My question is always, how can we be better equipped to engage the culture we live in? And what will help us to do it better and more effectively? And I hope that tonight is going to help us all to do that.